Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course of world history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are looking at British India. This is the rule of India and Pakistan, Burma, a bunch of different areas lumped together under the British rule during this imperialist period. Our essential question is, what is the impact of British rule in India? So we're going to start by talking about the British East India Company, because it was the company largely that controlled the country as the Mughal Empire starts to decline. So Mughals decline, the British East India Company is able to leverage that decline to get more and more power and more authority. Now, the British government does give this authority to the British East India Company and basically allows them to rule as they wish. Now, as a part of the British East India Company's ruling, they had to hire soldiers to kind of defend themselves. They largely hired a group of Indian soldiers known as the sepoys. So the sepoys were Indian soldiers that were hired and paid by the British East India Company to protect the company's interests in India. Now, in 1857, there is this growing distrust of the British. The Mughals now have virtually no authority whatsoever. The company itself is in charge. They are exploiting the Indian population in order to maximize profits, and people start to really distrust them, including the sepoys. Now, what triggers this revolt is rumors amongst the sepoys that the rifle cartridges, the rifle would have kind of this bag with a bullet stuffed on one end and then gunpowder, and this whole thing would be greased to allow that bullet to fire with fat and oil. There was rumors amongst the sepoys that the British were using cow fat and pig fat to do this greasing. This violates Hindu practices to use cow fat. It violates Muslim practices to use pig fat. And since the cartridge had to be bit and ripped, that would mean that the person would be getting cow or pig and ingesting it, which was a violation of their religions. Once this rumor got out that this was being used, a particular unit refused to use those cartridges, refused to fire their weapons because of this. And that unit was punished. It is the punishing of that unit that leads to an overall uprising, a rebellion amongst the sepoys. And this becomes known as the Great Rebellion by many, sometimes called the Sepoy Revolt, the Sepoy Mutiny. It's got a lot of different names. The British called it the Sepoy Mutiny. All right, so the effects of the revolt. The sepoys do outnumber the British. They've got about 230,000 soldiers versus 45,000, which are either British or other Europeans hired by the British East India Company, or a select number of sepoys that did remain loyal to the British. But the sepoys don't really have strong leadership. So their rebellion is put down because they don't effectively organize. The British government, however, looks at the situation and says, India is really profitable, and this company seems to be mismanaging things pretty badly if we've got this major revolt on our hands. So they do strip the British East India Company's right to rule, and the British begin direct rule in India. In most other areas of the world, we'll learn that the British prefer indirect rule, but they do go with direct rule through most of India. 1876, Queen Victoria goes a little bit further with this and declares herself the Empress of India and considers all of the people of India to be her colonial subjects. This is the opening of a period known as the British Raj, or the British rule. We'll refer to this as the Raj going forward. All right, so the benefits of British rule, the British Raj. Most of India was under a single efficient government. So the British did rule these lands efficiently and streamlined a lot of production and government services. Schools get established throughout India. And they do teach English as a common language because India is a hodgepodge of a lot of different local languages, local dialects. And it was difficult for governments to always communicate with each other and always find a common language. English became that common language throughout India. And even to this day, English is a very widely spoken language in India. The Raj also oversees the building of roads and canals, railroads, universities, hospitals, and a postal service, really providing a lot of modernization in a lot of those ways throughout India. You can see this map kind of shows the whole of the British India, and we've got a few images of some of the improvements. This is a canal, this is a university, obviously a railroad. All right, so the costs. It's not all good. It's quite a bit bad that comes from this because the Raj really focuses on producing raw materials, not on industry. They want to get resources out of the land and take them elsewhere. In terms of manufacturing goods, the British are selling low-cost manufactured goods from Britain in India. And this destroys any textile industry that had existed in India before. It's not cost-effective for Indians to weave their own cloth to sell that cloth when the British can just cut the prices so much lower than any Indian producer could. So any developing industries in India are just squashed during this time. Indian farmers are also forced to kind of shift their focus from food production to producing cotton for the textile industry in Britain. Can't grow cotton in Britain. Britain has to find sources of cotton elsewhere, and India becomes that place. So as India shifts to producing cotton for export, they shift away from producing food for domestic consumption, and this leads to starvation. And then 30 million people die of starvation during the British rule. 30 million people. That's not a small number. That is a massive number of people dying of starvation because of the focus on growing cotton instead of food. Additionally, the British disrespect Indian culture in a lot of small ways. An example of this is it became it was like the thing to do for the wealthy colonial elite to host weddings at the Taj Mahal. And one of the things that they did was guests would actually chip off pieces of the Taj Mahal to take home as souvenirs. So you can imagine quite a bit of damage was done through the decades of British rule. All right, Indian nationalists, so the people who don't like this and want to create their own country. Well, it starts in India with upper class, British educated, trained in law, worked for the government folk, who mostly wanted reform and not full independence. Now, this upper class, British educated, lawyer class working in government included people like this young man right here, who would grow up to have a very different perspective. This is a young Gandhi. Slow reform, however, convinces them to form a group called the Indian National Congress. Today, it's simply called the Congress Party, and it is still in existence, still very powerful in India. This body wanted independence, but they were initially divided and therefore somewhat ineffective because of the differing interests of the Hindu and Muslim members of that group. It winds up being the Hindus that dominate this party as the Muslims go to found a separate party. So let's talk about Gandhi a bit. In 1915, Gandhi returned to India and brought new life to this independence movement. He had spent quite a bit of time away. He had been educated in London, so sent off to London to receive a top-notch education in the law, and then worked as a lawyer in South Africa. And in his job as a lawyer in South Africa, he represented the interests of Indians who were living in South Africa, working as laborers for the British Empire. Now, he uses his experience fighting for the rights of the Indian people in South Africa to then come back to India and build this nonviolent resistance movement against the British in India, a movement which will eventually be successful and we'll circle back to in another unit when we look at decolonization. All right, so Indian culture. Ironically, it was British practices that lead to a rebirth in Indian culture. Because remember, the Indians have now been dominated by Britain. Before that, by the Mughals. It's been a while since they had a culture that they could control themselves. The British found universities which start to train scholars who start to study Indian culture. And once these cultural traditions and practices are a little bit more unearthed and a little bit more widely spread, it becomes more well known. And soon, Indian language texts are widely available, not English, but the local regional languages, and contain poetry, epics, histories that touch on their cultural past. This leads to a new search for an Indian national identity, which will wind up crossing their past with their present. Nationalist newspapers come out of this. This growing interest in literature increases literacy as a whole. So as more people are reading, there is then a larger market for newspapers. Newspapers have to be sold. You sell them to people who can read. You need a reading population in order for it to be profitable. But now, with the increase in literacy and interest in Indian past, we have a market for newspapers. And these newspapers become a tool of nationalism as they begin to really focus on supporting national causes and the idea of the birth of India's freedom. This would be an English language newspaper, but you would also have ones that were dual language or just local language as well. All right, we're going to talk about one more person before we go, and that is Rabindranath. I have practiced that so many times. Rabindranath. It's sometimes hard to pronounce names. Tagore, last name. This was the most famous Indian writer during the Raj. He used his writings to promote nationalist interests. And his most famous novel portrays this kind of tension that modern India has with this love-hate relationship between India and Britain. It's this struggle, it's this tension. Like, the British do a lot of things really well. They don't treat us well, but they do things really well. So what can we take from how the British operate and meld it with who we are culturally to create a new national identity? And a lot of his writing focused on that effort by the Indian people. All right, that is all for today. I do hope that you learned something, and I will see you next time. Farewell.